everyone. Welcome. My name is Deborah Griffith, and I am the University Archivist. This is Katie Seal. Walk on to Katie. And she is the State Historical Society of Missouri Rolla Research Center Archivist. We're both located down in the basement. I'm in G2, she's in G3. And welcome to the first in our series of 3 talks about different aspects of World War I. These talks coincide with our jointly produced Smithsonian poster exhibit, World War I, Lessons and Legacies, which is over there in the back of the room, over there. We also have contributions in the display cases from the U.S. Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood. This talk is being live streamed, which is why we're standing in front of this. And so now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, history professor Dr. Petra DeWitt. Dr. DeWitt is the author of several books on World War I.
No, just one.
Just one? She is all over WorldCat. She is also an award-winning teacher. I'm just going to give this year's list. She has recently received the 2019 Faculty Service Award, the 2018-2019 Sustained Excellence in Outstanding Teaching Award, and the 2019 Outstanding Teacher Award. So she is just rolling. And in addition, she is also an alum of this school, though under a different name, UM Rolla. So please, I just got new bridge work. Please welcome Dr. DeWitt. Oh, sorry.
It's the first one. As you said, I'm the guinea pig. Anyways, we will be talking about the creation of hyper-nationalism during World War I and the impact that it had on American society. There's so many aspects of World War I to be talking about that it's difficult to pick something and only talk 45 minutes, okay? So we'll be talking about this hyper-nationalism. What is hyper-nationalism? Hyper-nationalism is when people are being encouraged by government leaders, by community leaders to fully demonstrate their 100% Americanism, or be it 100% Germanism or Italianism or whatever, okay? And the world begins to look in black and white. You can't be somewhere in between, okay? So what I'll start off with is how it was created, how it came about, and then we'll talk about the legacies and the long-term impacts that came as a result of that, okay? It all began quite innocently enough with the creation of the Committee on Public Information. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had been reelected in 1916 on the promise, I will keep you out of that European war. And when 4 months later he asked Congress for a declaration of war, he kind of had to convince the American people to fully support it, right? So he established this Committee on Public Information. He actually put a Missourian in charge of it, George Creel. He was a Kansas City newspaper man, and he was really a progressive. We have to remember the early two decades of the 1900s are the progressive era. It's a time period when people believed that society should be improved, that people should be educated, and not just everything being shoved down their throats. So George Creel really believed that the American people had to be educated. Why are we in this war? And he believed in convincing the American people this is the right thing to do. We need to end militarism, especially that German militarism over there in Europe. And we need to make, as the President Woodrow Wilson was arguing, we need to make the world safe for democracy. So get rid of abusive, oppressive monarchies and replace them with democratic governments, allow countries that were being oppressed to have self-determination so they can change their own governments to the forms that they want instead of having these inherited monarchies. So George Creel sets about to convince the American people to support the war effort. And what do we need first? We need men. We need men who are going to go over there and fight and depose the Kaiser, right? So they appealed to the emotions of these men with posters like this one. Now, to explain better here, these are women and children, And what this poster really is appealing to, the sinking of ships, including the famous Lusitania, right? It had happened 2 years prior to the United States entering the war, but these posters are reminding the American people of how disastrous these submarines were out in the Atlantic. They are sinking ships, they are killing innocent women and children, right? So these Germans are barbaric. And so the thing that you can do as a man is join the Navy, volunteer, because this needs to end. This has to come to an end, right? So really appealing to your emotions that these innocent men and women, not children and women, were being killed. And if that message doesn't get you, maybe this one will. That these Germans, identified through the spiked helmet, are these barbarians, these brutes, that their culture or kultur is based on brutality, that it is bloody. And you have to sign up, you have to enlist to make sure that brute does not come on the shores of the United States of America. Because the same thing that's been happening in Europe, the burning of Belgium in essence, the ravaging of innocent women, that has to come to an end. So you need to enlist. The problem was, even though the messages are loud and clear, only about a little over 50,000 men actually volunteered and enlisted voluntarily. So what the government really quickly realized is, in order to win a war in which millions had already died, we need to do what? We need to set up a draft, okay? And they did that through the Selective Service Act that they passed in Congress really quickly, and the president duly signed into law. And on June 5, 1917, you have registration day. Every man 21 to 31 was required to sign up for the Selective Service. Once you signed up, you get a number assigned. Once you have that number assigned, you then wait for a letter that tells you you need to go before the draft board. And then the draft board will ask you questions. Are you married? Do you claim any exemptions? And so on. If they find you class 1, that is healthy, single, you're going to be drafted soon. If you're married with a dependent wife and dependent kids, you're going to be in the second category, okay? So that is, in essence, the reserve. If you're disabled, you don't have to worry about going to war, okay? But if you're older than 31, or if you're younger than 21, you still can serve your country. Because in 27 states, something else happens. A so-called Home Guard is being established. The United States government, since 1916, has the right to federalize the National Guard. And the National Guard were the first soldiers, in addition to approximately 100,000 regulars that were sent immediately over to France. So the National Guard is leaving the United States. What are you going to do if you have a national disaster? What if, heaven forbid, that German Hun comes and invades the United States? You need some kind of defense force here at home, right? And in 27 states, especially in the eastern half of the United States, you have the establishment of the Home Guard. And this is just a lapel pin for the Missouri Home Guard. It's the first infantry regiment from St. Louis. And these guys would be training out in the middle of the streets. And you see, hopefully you can see, you see older gentlemen here, and you see very young gentlemen here too. The bugle boy is usually the youngest one. You have sometimes 17-year-old boys joining the Home Guard with the permission of their parents. And they learn drills. Sometimes they have rifles, as they do here in Kansas City, for example. Others won't have them. Here's a photograph from the Yancey Mill Home Guard, just south here of town. But these guys, by drilling every week in public, like they do here in Potosi, they are the representatives, the visual example. There's a war on. It might not be happening in the United States, but there's a war on. And these guys are reminding everybody, the public, on a weekly basis, that this war is actually happening over there in Europe. And these guys are taking their duties seriously. The uniforms usually look well pressed. They learn rules and regulations. They learn how to implement orders and everything else. And in St. Louis, they were serious enough and fearful enough of the so-called enemy coming that they actually bought an armored car mounted with a Lewis machine gun to make sure that law and order was enforced in the city of St. Louis. Just in case. Just in case. I mean, there is a large German-American population in St. Louis. So is it along the Missouri River and parts of the Mississippi River, right? So there could be that potential that somebody, perhaps a recent immigrant from Germany, might get it into their minds that maybe a little sabotage is in order to limit the war effort by the United States, right? So for St. Louisans, it made sense that they would have such an armored car. So while men could be enlisting, could play by the rules of being drafted, and could volunteer. This Home Guard is totally volunteer. These guys were never paid for any of the service that they did. So while the men can demonstrate their patriotism through this military kind of participation, the rest of the family could also participate. And for that purpose, the Food Administration was established, another organization in the national government. And this Food Administration was under the leadership of a mining engineer by the name of Herbert Hoover. He had already made a name for himself by bringing relief to Belgium in 1915 and 1916. Belgium was occupied by the Germans, and the Germans actually allowed this relief organization under Herbert Hoover to go into Belgium to bring foodstuffs, to make sure that women and children would be surviving. But the Food Administration also aims to save food for our army as well as our allies. So it appeals to Americans to eat less wheat, less meat. They actually had wheat less days and meat less days, less sugar and fats. Instead, eat cornbread or oats or fish or fruits and vegetables and so on, right? So this is appealing to your sense of responsibility. We want to feed your brother, your husband, your son who's fighting over there, as well as our allies like the Belgians with the food that we're conserving here. Well, that's good. You could also sign a Hoover Pledge card, a little card on which you would be writing your name, and you pledge with your signature that you abide by these guidelines, by these suggestions. You'll eat more fish, less wheat, less meat, so that can go over to the allies and our soldiers. Problem is, you can't just pick that card up at the post office or the grocery store. Volunteers assigned to the Food Administration will come to your front door, knock on that door, and then ask you, would you please sign that card? How would you look if you said, no thank you, and closed the door? You wouldn't look very patriotic, would you? You might look like you're a little unpatriotic, perhaps disloyal, or want to make sure people starve to death over there in Belgium, right? So that could be definitely held against you. And advertisements made that very clear to the American people, because if you waste food, you commit a crime. Now, wait a minute, how do you feel? You feel like you have volunteer spirit? Or do you feel like you're maybe a little coerced into saving food, into not wasting food, right? And it's not only a crime, but it's the greatest crime in Christendom, right? So, again, appealing to your emotions, but at the same time also intimidating you into abiding by these regulations and rules, okay? Teachers, I would encourage students in school to waste less. So if they bring lunch from home, they better eat all that lunch instead of dumping it in the wastebasket, right? And teachers would bring these pledge cards to class too. Ask the students to sign them. And what do you think would happen to a kid that said, my daddy told me to never ever sign anything. What do you think would happen to that boy or girl?
Probably wouldn't do well in that class.
No. Peer pressure is an awful thing, right? Probably get stuck in a locker or whatever. Right? I don't know if they had lockers in classrooms back then or not, but they might get beaten up, right, for saying something like that. Kids were also asked to work in victory gardens. Here you have the teacher keeping an eye on everybody. So you actually get your PE, your physical exercise out there, but again, can you just say, I don't feel very good, I don't want to go out there and chop the weeds or harvest the potatoes? No, you kind of have to do it, right? So you feel, again, coerced and intimidated into doing that. And so we have the Committee of Information, Committee on Public Information, telling you what you're supposed to do. We have the Food Administration, another one of the government organizations that is telling you what to do. Then we have a third organization, and that is the Red Cross, that is also telling, kind of not telling, but yes, telling you what to do. And I don't know how well you can see this, but in the corner up here is a Red Cross nurse. They're usually volunteers. She's taking care of soldiers, and she's saying, send more supplies quickly, right? They're trying to help wounded soldiers, right? Here's Uncle Sam. And there's a wealthy individual who just doesn't listen to anything, right? He covers his ears and just keeps on singing and everything else. He spends his money as he wants. And Uncle Sam tells him, well, lawfully your money is yours. You may spend it whichever way you want. But at the bottom comes the real kicker. Take then thy lawful due. Live thou thy greedy life. But in so living, if thou dost shed one drop of soldier blood, and it's just left hanging there. Do you really want to be responsible for a soldier being hurt? Or if the soldier is being hurt, him not getting the care that a Red Cross nurse can give him? What else do you need to part with your money? Right? So go ahead and give largely and quickly to the Red Cross, okay? So really appealing to your emotions and kind of intimidating you into giving up your money. Now, in addition to being told by the Food Administration to conserve food, we also have a Liberty Loan Committee that asks you to buy war bonds in order to support this war. There will be 4 major war bond drives. One in May of 1917, a second one in October of 1917, a third one in April of 1918, a fourth one in September of 1918, and then just to bring it home, there will be a 5th, but that will be called a victory loan campaign to help pay the national debt that was increased in order to fight this war. And initially, the appeals to the American people are very simple. Again, it starts off simple enough, right? The idea is to appeal to your spirit of patriotism, to your sense of duty as an American citizen, right? So here they are, the nurse, the airman, the soldier, the sailor, who are giving their lives. Will you lend your dollar? Okay? Just in case you have a little business sense, it's also a promise that Uncle Sam will pay you well for the loan. Usually they would be locked for 5 years, but they would earn 4% interest. It's more than what we make right now on a 30-year CD, right? So, if you're smart enough, you buy those bonds because you know how to invest, right? But it also appeals to your emotions. You want to help them. You want to clothe, feed, and equip them. So therefore, you ought to pass or part with your hard-earned money. You can buy them in $50 increments. So an ordinary person might buy a $50 bond. A more wealthy person can invest $500 if they want to in those bonds. Interestingly, in several communities, the names of purchasers would be published in newspapers. So if you have your name published in the newspaper, everybody knows you are patriotic and loyal, right? And then you question, well, how come my neighbor's name isn't in the newspaper, right? They then become the less patriotic or perhaps disloyal individuals, right? Posters for the Liberty Loan also appeal to immigrants. A sense of duty. Remember your first thrill of American liberty when you sailed past the Statue of Liberty on your way to Ellis Island, right? The United States gave you freedom. The United States gave you opportunity. Now it's your duty to give back and buy Liberty bonds, okay? So it's kind of, we gave you something, you kind of owe us something back now, right? The problem is that these kinds of appeals to emotions go into overdrive by the third Liberty Loan in April of 1918. By April of 1918, we have this hyper-nationalism present. And in April of 1918, you have to prove that you're an American. You're only 100% American if you buy Liberty bonds. If you don't buy any Liberty bonds, what are you? You're not American. You possibly want to support the enemy in this war, right? You are pro-German. There is no more gray area in between, right? You're either with us or you're with them, right? At this point, you're no longer somewhere in between. And what makes this so interesting is that this is not just happening through advertisements, these posters that I've been showing you, right, that are in newspapers, that appear everywhere, plastered on public buildings and grocery stores and so on. But it seems that an act passed by Congress is reinforcing this creation of this hyper-nationalism. And that is the Espionage Act passed in June of 1917. Now, when this act was initially passed, the purpose was to, A, find spies, okay? Espionage, yeah, they're looking for spies. If somebody, a German, an Austrian, or somebody else is spying in the United States, they should be able to get arrested, punished, sent to prison, and eventually deported, okay? The language within that Espionage Act aims to make sure that our military and our soldiers are being protected from possible sabotage, from possible spying, from possible interference, okay? So anybody who willfully hinders the draft, incites mutiny in the military or interferes with the military can expect a fine of no more than $10,000 or imprisonment of no more than 2 years in federal prison when convicted. Problem is how it is being enforced. Who are the people who figure out who's a spy? Who are the people who figure out somebody is trying to interfere with the military? There's one particular organization that the Justice Department now establishes for the purpose of enforcing this Espionage Act, and that is the American Protective League. American Protective League is an entirely volunteer organization under the jurisdiction of the Justice Department. You can volunteer, you get this little badge, you have your own little number, and you take an oath. I, whatever your name is, a member of the American Protective League, organized and operating under the direction of the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Investigation, do hereby solemnly swear that I am a citizen of the United States of America and that I will uphold and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, as a true and loyal citizen thereof, that I will give due time and diligent attention to such service in this department as I shall volunteer. They did not get paid for their service. To render, and that I will promptly report all information of every kind and character, and from whatever source derived, tending to prove hostile or disloyal acts or intentions on the part of any person whatsoever. What did they just swear to do? They just swore to spy. Spy on anybody and everybody, right? So imagine, you're a farmer. You've been working all week long on your farm. That's backbreaking work, right? Or you're a factory worker. And you're coming home. Well, on the way home, you probably stop in a tavern. You're going to have a beer. You want to relax, right? For some reason, I don't know, alcohol consumption loosens the tongues, right? And people say things that perhaps in more sober circumstances they would not have said, right? So we have, for example, a person up in Bland, Missouri, by the name of August Hybrider. That doesn't show up very well here. Anyways, he is 62 years old. He's a farmer, and while he was at a tavern drinking a beer, he said President Wilson ought to be put in the mouth of a cannon and shot out. If anyone would put him in, I would shoot him as far as the ocean as he would go. He was promptly identified by members of the APL who was sitting there. They had, coats on, conveniently covering up their badges. So once he said that, and they heard it, they uncovered their badge and arrested him. And he was charged under the Espionage Act. Why? Because he threatened the life of the commander-in-chief, thus potentially interfering with the military. And that's exactly what the Espionage Act aimed to prevent from happening, right? Now, the poor man was lucky enough to go before a judge who realized, that would have never interfered with the military. He should have kept his mouth shut and I'll fine him $100, but he didn't go to prison, right? So that didn't always happen. Quite a number of people would actually wind up in places like Fort Leavenworth and would be serving 2 years, including the famous or infamous socialist by the name of, what was his name? I can't remember. Eugene V. Debs. Thank you. The second you said it, I'll remember. Okay. Here's another example. Again, a person who said something in conversation. He supposedly said, damn the government, it is not a real government, just a rotten political machine. Back then we had lots of political machines in the United States. All I have to say is Pendergast, Kansas City, right? So you would know that. But they realized anything said in conversation, in private conversation, should not really be charged under the Espionage Act. However, if the person had stated it in public, that would be different. If you're on a soapbox at a corner of a street and you're advocating that the Kaiser will kill them all, then they're justified in so many words to arrest them under the Espionage Act. Okay? So, all these organizations are being established. What was the intended outcome of the establishment of the Committee on Public Information, the Food Administration, the Red Cross, the Espionage Act, and all the other organizations that were being established? Well, what George Creel wanted, he wanted to create a white-hot mass of patriotic Americans who would support the war effort. And if we look just at the number or the amount of money in war bonds that was being sold during 2 years, $23 billion worth, I think they succeeded, didn't they? Right? And they did conserve a lot of natural resources, lots of wheat, lots of beef would be going over to Europe, and farmers would be really eager to plow under the right-of-way and improve productivity of their acreage so that we could send more and more food over there. And we would continue doing that in 1919 and 1920, 2 years after the war as well. Because it would take a while, especially for areas like Belgium and northern France, to be rebuilt so that they can farm themselves and feed themselves again. But there were unintended outcomes as well. So many people were arrested under the Espionage Act that members of Congress thought, there's a real problem in the United States. There are really spies out here. There are really pro-Germans out here. So we need to pass a tougher law yet. And that would be the infamous Sedition Act of 1918. What does that infamous Act of 1918 state? Whoever shall willfully interfere with the operation of the military, promote the success of its enemies, obstruct the sale of United States bonds, incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government, the Constitution, or the military, or whoever shall willfully advocate or suggest the doing of any of these acts shall be punished by a fine of no more than $10,000 or imprisonment of no more than 2 years.
2 or 20.
Oh, I'm sorry, 20 years. I'm going to ask you all a question.
That was passed.
Yes? Have any of you ever said anything negative about your United States government?
Definitely not.
President of the United States.
That was passed.
Raise your hand. Right? Lots of people express their opinions. We're not always happy with our government, right? So this only added further fuel to the fire of hyper-nationalism. You no longer could express your opinions. You could no longer trust anybody. Because if your neighbor heard you say something negative about the war effort, the government, or the president, you could be charged under the Sedition Act. Okay? Now, it's a good thing that the war only lasted 5-6 more months after the passage of this, and the Sedition Act would go away with the next administration because the war had come to an end. The question is, what if the war had lasted longer? How internalized would that law have become? Okay? So it is one of the things, and I'll talk some more about that in a little bit here. Whoops, no, not yet.
So that never had a chance to be adjudicated in court, Supreme Court, or anything?
No, not the Sedition Act. Not the Sedition Act, okay? Another unintended outcome, because of the existence of that hyper-nationalism, is now that, with the Sedition Act, that seems to give everybody the freedom to just attack anything that represents the enemy, right? It seems that you have national authorization to critique anything that seems to be positive about the enemy, right? Anything associated with the enemy. Be it that somebody speaking German on the streets is reading a German language newspaper, right? Or says anything negative or about our country, right? Barns and houses were painted yellow, belonging to people who, according to some people, thought didn't buy enough war bonds. Yeah, because, the APL can find out how much money you have in your savings account. All means whatsoever. They go talk to the banker. How much does this wealthy person have in a bank account? He only bought $100 worth of Liberty bonds. We know he's got $2,000 in savings. He could have bought at least one more bond, right? So we'll paint his barn yellow. Therefore, he's encouraged to not be a coward, but to stand up and demonstrate his 100% Americanism, right? We have there's evidence of a few tar and feather ceremonies, but not in the state of Missouri. What I found evidence for is 3 public flag-kissing ceremonies. One was in Jefferson City. The poor guy was not only German-American, but he was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World on top of it, so he was a socialist. He had 2 things against him, because the socialists were outspoken critics of the war. They were totally opposed to this war by the manufacturers and the wealthy people, and its poor people were dying in the war as the soldiers, right? In St. Louis, there was one kissing ceremony, and then there was one in Chamois in Osage County. It's a very unique situation there, because it's German Americans who force another German American to kiss the flag because he had said something bad about the local home guard. And these guys who forced him to kiss the flag were members of that Home Guard. They demonstrated their patriotism through membership in that Home Guard, and he critiqued their patriotism, right? So it's German Americans controlling the behavior of other German Americans. So very unique situation there. And it also leads to one murder, one lynching of Robert Prager in Collinsville, Illinois, just over the border from Missouri, from St. Louis into Illinois. He was a German immigrant, actually, and he had made comments like, the Kaiser will whoop them all, and nobody can overcome the Kaiser's armies, and, you know, really pro-German expressions. He should have been smarter, keep his mouth shut, right? But he thought he had the right to express his opinion, freedom of speech in the United States, right? Protected under the First Amendment. And he gets into a melee with some fellow workers. They're all workers in the local coal mines. And the sheriff hears about the rout, and he actually arrests Prager to protect his life. He jails him. But then a posse comes overnight, and they break him out of jail. They're heavily armed, and the sheriff can't do anything, so in order to protect his own life, he just, you know, he has to step to the side, and they take Robert Prager out, and they lynch him, okay? So it's the only such murder that happened during World War I in the United States, okay?
That's documented as such.
That is documented as such, yes, that is correct, right? So these were the unintended outcomes of this hyper-nationalism. And this definitely now has an impact on the German-American population in the United States as well as Missouri. You now have a serious effort to get rid of any remnants of the German culture, be it speaking public in German, hearing your sermons on Sunday in German, or these German language newspapers. And I like this cartoon because, you know, here's a little slithery snake with a Prussian helmet. The argument that they're making is, we can't read that language. We don't know what's being printed in that newspaper. This could be German propaganda, trying to convince any people who can still speak the German language to rise up against the American military, to rise up against the American government, and to seriously hinder the American war effort. So you do prove your 100% Americanism if you get rid of these remnants of the German culture. And an act passed by Congress reinforces or encourages this kind of action, and that is the Trading with the Enemy Act. It prohibits any company in the United States from trading with any German company. It establishes the position or office of the alien property custodian, who has the right to take property owned by Germans in the United States away from them, be it stocks that somebody owns in a company, be it that, like the Bush family in St. Louis owning certain property in the United States. Why were they targeted? Because two of their daughters had married German nationals and had moved to Germany. Mrs. Bush herself was in Germany when the war broke out in 1914, and she opened up her mansion as a hospital for German soldiers. In other words, she gave aid and comfort to the enemy, and that's why they took her property away. It took her years in courts to get that back. She's a U.S. citizen, right? But she lost her property because she aided and comforted the enemy over there in Germany.
Are you referring to Bush as an Anheuser-Busch?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
make sure.
Yep.
Make sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a unique experience. And so there is this effort to get rid of the German language press in states like Iowa, where we have a Governor Herding, the future President of the United States, by governor proclamation, by executive proclamation, outlawing the use of German in Iowa. You could no longer learn the language in school. you were no longer allowed to speak it or anything. Okay, now we didn't go quite that far here in Missouri because, I don't know if you know this, but back then our assembly only met every other year, and they had adjourned before the war began, or the United States entered the war, and the governor did not see a need to call for a special session, so they were not assembling while we were fighting for 18 months in that war, right? So we didn't go that far. But what happened is that local communities would pass ordinances. So in some communities, you actually see the prohibition of the German language. And that, in essence, was also encouraged by our governor. Governor Frederick Gardner, in April of 1918, really tells what he thinks should happen in Missouri. He who does not know what Kultur means is either a fool or a knave or both. There can be no half-hearted allegiance at a time like this. Everyone within our boundaries is either for or against us. Again, no more gray area, right? You're either American or you're pro-German, right? Let's see. If at any time I become convinced that there is in any community in this state an organized movement of these traitorous wretches, referring to spies, having for its object the embarrassment of the state or federal government in the prosecution of their respective war activities, if I deem it necessary, I shall, without delay and without any qualms of conscience, declare martial law in such community, and as Commander-in-Chief of the state's military forces shall take immediate control of the situation, suspend the right of habeas corpus, and order all whatever of the I can't make out that word now. Oops. Order all enemies of the republic tried by court-martial, and if they be found guilty, it would mean that they would face a firing squad, and thus suffer the fate which traitors so richly deserve. Missouri is no place for traitors while I am governor. I think he makes his position clear, doesn't he? And that only further encourages Missourians and others, because this is replicated in all kinds of other states in the United States, to assure that that remnants of German culture will be abolished. And here's one of these attempts in Cass County, for example. They are encouraging the telephone company to make sure that nobody speaks in German. And the thing back then, you could listen in. Yes, party lines, absolutely, right? So you can listen in if your neighbor is speaking German over the phone. They hear it and they report you immediately, right? So it behooves you to no longer speak in German, and it encourages all kinds of companies, individuals, and public entities to change their names. Anything that they still have in their titles, in their names, that seems to associate them with anything German, they now get rid of, okay? So in Kansas City, for example, the German hospital, a famous hospital, much research what they conducted there, now becomes the research hospital. They just get rid of the word German and rename it research hospital, okay? Then you have, in St. Louis, aldermen beginning to change street names. Von Versen becomes Enright, I think that must be a typo in the newspaper. Kaiser Avenue now becomes Gresham Avenue, and Knappstein becomes Providence. And you also have people writing in letters to the editor of the newspaper saying, there's one more street we need to change, and that is Berlin Avenue. We can't have a Berlin Avenue in St. Louis. We need to name it after our general, who was in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, who was? Yes, General Pershing, right? So, if any of you have ever been in St. Louis, that's the reason why there's Pershing. Okay. Companies like the Kaiser Hoon Grocery Company, he was afraid that he was going to be called Kaiser Hun Grocery Company because it's so close in spelling, right? So he's going to change his, he's going to call his company now the Pioneer Grocery Company, okay? An individual man who's born in the United States. His wife is well known as a soloist in the choir of the First Presbyterian Church. Now decides he should change his name. His last name was Schutz. He's a patriotic American, but you know the name itself creates suspicion, right? So he has his name changed to Sears. Good old American business name, right? And this probably doesn't turn out too well, but a small town in Gasconade by the name of Pottsdale will have its name changed also to Pershing. And these name changes are being replicated state over state over state in the United States. This is how you demonstrate your patriotism. You're not associating yourself with anything German out there, okay? And the same happens in a number of churches. So many of the Lutheran churches still were offering sermons in German because the ministers believed the only way you really truly understand the Word of God is if you hear it in German. Yes, absolutely, right? So now these ministers are being encouraged to at least begin offering English services. They could understand that the older generation, perhaps the original immigrants, that they still have a right to hear the Word of God in German. But their kids, their American-born kids and their American-born grandkids, should hear it in English. Okay? So that definitely then becomes a major movement as well. So, what are the lessons and legacies to be learned from all these efforts to encourage patriotism in the United States and to limit any association with anything German? What are those lessons and legacies? The national government entered the lives of the American people as never before. There were so many organizations established, and I've only scratched the surface here, with the Food Administration, the Liberty Loan campaigns, the Committee on Public Information, the Trading with the Enemy Act, and so on. And it goes away after the war is over, but it sets an important precedent. When we have the next big one, WWII, World War II, the government again sets up similar organizations. The problem is after World War II, they don't go away because we need them during the Cold War, or at least they perceive the need that they need them during the Cold War, right? So that's why we have an ever-growing national government with ever more multiple organizations and departments in the administration. The regulations seriously limited speech and press. I was talking about the Trading with the Enemy Act, right? The Trading with the Enemy Act required that newspaper editors who published in a foreign language file a translation of any article related to the war, the government, or the military with the local postmaster. If you did not do that, the Postmaster General had the authorization to take your second-class mailing privileges away. Many of the newspapers barely were at the profit margin, right? Many of them were already in the red. Paper was in shortage during the war. Ink was in shortage during the war. And if they all of a sudden would have to pay more in postage, these newspapers would go under. So what are you going to do? You file those translations, right? Or perhaps the easiest thing is anything related to the war, you just put in there in English. And the rest of, culture, recipes, and that's all still in, the social news is still in the foreign language, right? So the press is definitely limited during the war as well. And we were talking about the Sedition Act, right? The Sedition Act goes away, but one remains. Which one was the original act? The Espionage Act. In 1919, the Supreme Court in Schenck versus United States actually declares the Espionage Act constitutional, and it is still with us today.
Are you in trouble?
No, I'm not in trouble. Because A, I'm not a socialist. It was used 2-3 times actually against socialists who published anti-United States arguments in newspapers. So the socialist newspapers were shut down. It actually gives justification in 1919 to deport all kinds of individuals who were members of socialist organizations to be deported if they came from Italy, from Poland, or anything like that. They usually were just rounded up and kicked out of the United States for holding socialist ideology through membership in certain unions. Okay. The Espionage Act was actually used against Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were the only people officially known to ever be executed under this act. In 1972, the New York Times was charged under the Espionage Act for publishing the Pentagon Papers. Very good. And most recently, a young man had to flee to Russia, Edward Snowden, because he revealed in, the Washington Post, certain practices by the NSA, right? So he's charged under the Espionage Act. If he ever leaves Russia, he's going to go to trial under that Espionage Act. Okay? So that act is still out there. It is one of the longest legacies to come out of this war. Okay? The implementation of federal guidelines inspired this hyper-nationalism that I was talking about. It created this harassment of German Americans, of socialists, or anybody defined as disloyal. And as we talked about here today, it was very easy for you to be defined as disloyal if you were not able to prove your loyalty or patriotism. And that led in some cases to vigilante justice, you know, like the barns being painted yellow, or you had to kiss the flag, or in the case of Robert Prager, that he was actually lynched. Okay? This hyper-nationalism, created during World War I, rolls right over in 1919 into the so-called Palmer Rates. I already referred to that very briefly. If you were a member of the IWW, you were an immigrant, you were rounded up and you were deported from the United States, right? This mindset, this fear of un-American ideology, of not being 100% American, also convinces the American people, especially in Congress, to look at immigration. And for the very first time, we set up a quota system for immigrants from Europe. Now, we had done that previously with immigrants from Asia with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. We had also excluded Japanese Americans, had denied them citizenship and so on. But this is the first time. I mean, the majority of immigrants in the United States did come from Europe, right? So this is the first time that they're saying, well, let's stop. And it sets an important precedent. Every time there is fear that too much un-American influence is coming into the United States, we're redoing our immigration laws. I don't have to say anything about current practices, right? So this sets an important precedent for how we still rethink every so often when we think we're under attack by some un-American elements, our immigration laws, okay? And so I'm going to leave you with this image here. This is a publication from the Chicago Tribune from 1919. There's a wall with a gate. Can you see the connection? Okay. Now I'm going to stop talking here, and I'm going to ask you if you have any questions.
Dr. DeWitt, I think you've answered the question I'm going to ask, and I'm ask it again. Why was there so much distrust and animosity towards Americans of
Of German
German
American?
heritage, which I am, during before World War I and during the war, other than these laws like the Sedition Act? Give me one or two reasons why there was so much hatred towards us.
In a way-
Towards them. I didn't mean.
It's individuals like Theodore Roosevelt who have been talking about the so-called hyphenates in American society even before World War I breaks out because of the 1911 Immigration Commission report. This, in 1911, the American people for the very first time, for some reason, realized, oh, we're a multi-ethnic country? They knew that before. They just, here's a report. There are so many millions of German Americans. There are so many hundreds of thousands of Italians. There are so many Poles. There are so many Jews, and so on, right? And that sounds like it is un-American, right? The original immigrants came from Britain. They came from France, from Scandinavia, and Germany's caught in there, right? Because Germany is really the largest ethnic group if you don't define the British as an ethnic group, right? So, so people like President Roosevelt have been talking about hyphenates needing to become full Americans, that they should not be half this, half that, okay? And that language is now being carried over into World War I with this hyper-nationalism. You really have to prove you're 100% Americanism, right? So the language is there, but it hasn't been turned into this super, you must here and you must there, but people are talking about it. And then with all the propaganda that's being created, how bad the Germans are, this then translates into that German Americans becoming the primary targets. Does that help?
It does. My grandma told my mother in Concordia, we were in Freedom Township, they spoke a lot of German. You didn't have to worry about speaking. But when they would go 8 miles to the east in Saline County to Sweet Springs to shop, Grandma would tell my mother, be sure not to speak any German. Don't say anything if you can't say it in English. I'm just giving you an example.
Yeah. And that's what I found in my research, that in very ethnically homogeneous communities, where the majority, 80% were German Americans, no problem, right? But if you were a minority in another community, like in Cass County, for example, where they set up this phone surveillance of whether you spoke German on the phone or not, they were really targeting the minority in the county. And if you were the minority, it was more likely that you were targeted because you could not protect yourself, because you were not in charge of local politics, right? So where you're 80%, the mayor's German American, right? The city council is German American, the sheriff is German American, right? But if you're a minority, then somebody might be Italian American, right? Definitely the enemy of Austria, right? So you're automatically looked upon as being patriotic, right? So, and they're going to turn you in if you're minority German American, right? So it depends on how homogeneous the community is. Yeah.
I would suggest, though, that everything you're talking about here, you can apply to all the earlier wars also.
Sure.
As far as German Americans in Missouri, just look at the Civil War.
Oh yeah, they're
General
Union.
Lyons.
Yeah.
You've got the Germans who were the nucleus of the initial North Union forces. So there's been a great deal of animosity that way.
And they actually use, as a defense, they use their patriotism during the Civil War to say, why are you targeting us
Yes,
now?
but it goes back. It's not just Germans and Americans. It's the North and the South. It's the British against what was it? The rebels against the Tories. This stuff has happened in every war because you can get involved, you can get really wrapped around the social issues, but you also have to remember that there is a war going on.
Absolutely.
And there is espionage, there are spies, there are ships being sunk, people being killed, supplies being damaged, So it's not all just made up.
No, it isn't. In Missouri, there was a rumor that the Frisco Bridge between Monette and Pierce City was going to be blown up. It never was, but the rumor was enough, right? Yes?
Why wasn't Vienna, Missouri renamed? I know it's
That's a real good question. It has a reasonably large German-American community there, so they can prevent it, but there never was a serious effort to rename that.
I think they've got the story. It's not actually named after Vienna. It's B. Anna, so two Annas, because the mother and the daughter are named Anna of one of the founding families. This is the story, so I don't know if it came about at this time. It's like, oh no, this is not named after the Austrian city. This is our founding member.
That's not Versailles either. It's Versailles.
Exactly. I was going to say with American, Missouri accent.
Good question, though. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
No, I had another question I was going to say. That also made me think of the capital of North Dakota, Bismarck.
Yeah, good, yeah. But that it does have a strong German community up there too. Yeah.
I was going to ask, was the prejudice against German American communities, was it more or less extreme during World War II than it was in World War I?
Oh, that depends of whether you had the so-called Bund within your community, and that in essence was a pro-Nazi organization. So many of the German-American communities, because of the experience of World War I, spoke out so heavily against the Nazi regime and Hitler in Germany that the pressure to be 100% American was no longer there. Most were speaking English now. There were maybe 2 or 3 newspapers in the German language in the United States as a whole, none anymore in Missouri by World War II. So they had much more assimilated into the American lifestyle and American language and everything that there seemed to be no need to charge them with disloyalty. I said, okay.
Are there any martyrs who embrace this and they just make a spectacle of themselves by challenging all this?
You have individuals like Eugene V. Debs, who speaks out. You have women like Emma Goldberg, who are speaking out. Of course, they all wind up in prison. Emma Goldberg winds up in Jersey City, at the walls, which JCCC, as they call it. So these are the 2 that come to mind immediately.
Did they have that in mind? Did they want to be arrested and in prison as symbolic of speaking out against it?
I think with Eugene B. Debs, certainly. I'm not so certain about Emma Goldberg that she wanted to do that. There was also, the name is not right. I can't think of her first name. There's a lady in Kansas City who does specifically publish articles in the Kansas City Star and one of the other papers in Kansas City. Her last name is Parks. I can't think of the first name right now. She will have a major trial, a very public trial. The war comes to an end, and she never winds up in prison, but she's very determined to speak out because she makes the argument that even during wartime, it is necessary to critique when you see something being done wrong.
Would you agree, I think the prevailing foreign policy at that time was isolation. The belief that we didn't want to get involved in Europe. Europe's problem.
Well, that kind of also goes back to the good old Monroe Doctrine, right? We're in charge of the Western Hemisphere, the Europeans are in charge of Europe. We had just fought a major war against Spain with the Spanish-American War in 1898. So there really was widespread belief that we should not get involved in that war in Europe, okay? And even the sinking of the Lusitania, we have to remember that was 2 years before we entered the war, right? Didn't bring about American involvement.
So I sit here and think, all of the events that you talked about after, starting with the selective service, were driven in part by that desire to remain isolationist and not get involved. And then it just seems like it got out of control.
Well, we
Trying
kind of
to turn that around.
Yeah, we kind of withdraw in the 1920s, okay? We're financially involved with the Dawes Act and things like that. But we also have a gentleman's agreement with the major powers to reduce our navies and our armies in size and so on. So we're willing to go back to a little bit more withdrawal. I don't like the word isolationist because we still trade with each other and we interact with each other, right?
Well, I mean it in
but
a
yeah,
narrow
yeah,
sense
yeah.
of not wanting to
Yeah,
get involved.
well, militarily, yeah, I understand that. And that also explains why we don't become immediately involved in World War II. After all, it takes the attack in Hawaii, right? So we want to stay out of those. We don't want to get entangled into these European conflicts. Indeed, it's also the reason why we didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, because so many of the congressmen thought if we become a member of the League of Nations, then we would be entangled in European affairs, right? So that convinces them not to sign that or ratify that treaty. Right?
Was there much opposition to the force of conscription?
No, there wasn't.
So
There
then-
wasn't.
so the-
Looking at the men played it by the rules. Okay, you had 12 categories of exemptions. The first one, the most important one, was the dependent wife and kids, right? But there were so many other categories. Were you a minister? Were you a government employee? You had all these individual exemptions, and people used them legitimately. And you have very few who actually resist the draft or not filling out the cards. So the men are abiding, but they're taking advantage of any and all of the exemptions that they can get their hands on. Yeah.
What was the name of the gentleman from Gascony County that, under the influence of alcohol, suggested shooting the president?
August Heitreiter. August Heitreiter.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, very interesting.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Yes.
We still have some cookies left. We have flyers for the next two talks next week. Next Tuesday will be Dr. David Westenberg talking about the Spanish flu. And on Thursday will be Dr. Larry Gregg, sitting over there pretending he's not involved in this, talking about how the university was involved in the war effort.
And if you haven't, please take a look at the exhibit that we have and all the posters and everything.
Yeah, you'll see a lot of information on our involvement in
That's
Red Cross,
kind of like
Liberty Loans,
American Collectively.
German
First
communities.
Five.
Absolutely.
It was very good, thank
Yes,
you. I needed that. Good dose.
Okay, that's it.